Orthodox Survival Course by Father Seraphim Rose and Father Podmashinsky. Lecture 9. Revolution. A. Introduction. 1. Second half of the 19th century. Realism replaces romanticism. Scientific replaces utopian socialism. Idea of class warfare is pushed by propagandists like Marx. Growing industrialism with factory conditions adds to unrest and disturbances. Revolution stops dreaming and calls for action. 2. Here we see the most radical revolutionary philosophies. But no one of these will entirely reveal to us the theology of the revolution. We must put them all together and apply the standard of Orthodox Christianity. 3. Activity of the devil becomes ever more evident, and his name now begins to be invoked. Ivan Karamazov. B. Revolution of 1848. 1. Produced little results in itself, but raised the red specter. Marx's Communist Manifesto came out in January 1848, just before the revolutions. Revolution started in France February 22nd, when banquets and demonstrations of reformers prompted in a few hours the king to flee. Social reformers met to plan the Republic then. Webster 136 through 7, 8, and 9. Thus, in the space of a few hours, the monarchy was swept away and the Social Democratic Republic was proclaimed. But now the men who had brought about the crisis were faced with the work of reconstruction, a very different matter. For it is one thing to sit at one's desk peacefully writing about the beauties of revolution. It is quite another to find oneself in the midst of a tumultuous city where all the springs of law and order have been broken. It is one thing to talk romantically about the sovereignty of the people. It is less soothing to one's vanity to be confronted with working men of real flesh and blood insolently demanding the fulfillment of the promises one has made them. This was the experience that fell to the lot of the men composing the provisional government the day after the king's abdication. All advocates of social revolution, they now for the first time saw revolution face to face, and liked it less well than on paper. The hoisting of the red flag by the populace, described by Lamartine as the symbol of threats and disorders, had struck terror into the hearts of all except Louis Blanc, and it was not until Lamartine, in an impassioned speech, had besought the angry multitude to restore the tricolore that the red flag was finally lowered and the deputies were able to retire to the Hôtel de Ville and discuss the new scheme of government. In all the history of the labor movement, no more dramatic scene has ever been enacted than that which now took place. Seated around the council table were the men who for the last 10 years had fired the people with enthusiasm for the principles of the first revolution. Lamartine, Panegyrist of the Gironde, Louis Blanc, the Robespierriste, Ledru Rollin, whose chief source of pride was his supposed resemblance to Danton. Suddenly the door of the council chamber burst open, and a working man entered, gun in hand, his face convulsed with rage, followed by several of his comrades. Advancing towards the table where sat the trembling demagogues, Marquis, for this was the name of the leader of the deputation, struck the floor with the butt end of his gun and said loudly, "Citizens, it is 24 hours since the revolution was made. The people await the results. They send me to tell you that they will brook no more delays. They wish for the right to work at once. 24 hours since the revolution had been made, and the new heavens and the new earth had not yet been created. The theorists had calculated without the immense impatience of the people. They had forgotten that to simple practical minds, to give is to give quickly and at once, that the immense social changes represented by Louis Blanc in his Organisation du Travail as quite a simple matter had been accepted by the workers in the same unquestioning spirit, of the enormous difficulties incidental to the readjustment of the conditions of the labor, of the time it must take to reconstruct the whole social system, Marquis and his companions could have no conception. They had been promised the right to work, and the gigantic organization that brief formula entailed was to be accomplished in one day and instantly put into operation. Louis Blanc admits that his first emotion on hearing the tirade of Marquis was that of anger. It were better if he had said of shame. It was he, more than any other, who had shown the workers the land of promise, and now that it had proved a mirage, he, more than any other, was to blame. Before promising, one must know how to perform, and to perform without delay. It was apparently Lamartine whom the working men regarded as the chief obstacle to their demand for the right to work, for throughout his speech, Marquis had fixed his eyes, blazing with audacity, on those of the poet of the Gironde. Lamartine, outraged by this attitude, thereupon replied in an imperious tone that were he threatened by 1,000 deaths, were he led by Marquis and his companions before the loaded cannons down beneath the windows, he would never sign a decree of which he did not understand the meaning. But finally, conquering his irritation, he adopted a more conciliatory tone, and placing his hand on the arm of the angry workman, he besought him to have patience, pointing out that, legitimate as his demand might be, so great a measure as the organization of labor must take time to elaborate, that in the face of so many crying needs, the government must be given time to formulate its schemes, that all competent men must be consulted. The eloquence of the poet triumphed. Gradually Marquis's indignation died down. The workmen, honest men touched by the evident sincerity of the speaker, looked into each other's eyes questioningly, with an expression of relenting, and Marquis, interpreting their attitude, cried out, "Well then, yes, we will wait. We will have confidence in our government. The people will wait. They place 3 months of misery at the service of the Republic." Have more pathetic words ever been uttered in the whole history of social revolution? Like their forefathers of 1792, these men were ready to suffer, to sacrifice themselves for the new formed Republic represented to them as the one hope of salvation for France. And animated by this noble enthusiasm, they were willing to trust the political charlatans who had led them on with fair promises into abortive insurrection. Even whilst Lamartine was urging patience, Louis Blanc, still intent on his untried theories, had retired into the embrasure of a window, where, with Flocon and Ledru Rollin, he drew up the decree, founded on the 10th article of Robespierre's Declaration of the Rights of Man, by which the provincial government undertook to guarantee work to all citizens. Louis Blanc was probably the only man present who believed in the possibility of carrying out this promise, yet all ended by subscribing to it, and the same day the decree was publicly proclaimed throughout Paris. 2 days later, the national workshops, which were to provide the promised employment, were opened under the direction of Emile Thomas and of M. Marie. The result was inevitably disastrous. Necessary work being insufficient, the workmen were sent hither and thither from one employer to another. Useless jobs were devised that necessarily proved discouraging to the men engaged on them, whilst the workers in the skilled trades for whom no employment could be found had to be maintained on an unemployment dole. This last measure, the most demoralizing of all, had the effect of attracting thousands of workers from all over the country, and even from abroad, into the capital. Workers were idealistic. Webster 141 through 142. The working men on their part showed themselves in the main perfectly sane and reasonable, demanding protection from the exploitation of middlemen, and a reduction in the hours of labor to 10 or 11 a day, giving for their reason a theory tenable perhaps at a period when working days consisted of 14 or 15 hours, but which today has been perverted into the disastrous system known as C.A. Canny, namely, that the longer the day is, the fewer workers are employed, and that the workers who are occupied absorb a salary which might be divided amongst a greater number of workers. They also criticized excessive work as an obstacle to their education and the intellectual development of the people. At any rate, whether sound or not in their political economy, the people of Paris at this crisis showed themselves in no way prone to violence. The people did not wish for bloodshed and for barricades, for burnings and destruction. Reduced to its simplest expression, they asked for two things only: bread and work. What juster demand could have been formulated? And they were ready, as Marquis had said, to wait, to suffer, to sacrifice themselves not only for their own ultimate welfare, but for the glory of France. Misled as they had been by visionaries, illusioned as they were on the benefits of the First French Revolution, they asked for no repetition of its horrors, but only to be allowed to work in peace and fraternity. Citizens, wrote the cloth printers to the provisional government at the end of March 1848, we, workers, ourselves, printers on stuff, we offer you to our feeble cooperation. We bring you 2,000 francs to help towards the success of your noble creation. Let them be reassured, those who may believe in a return to the bloody scenes enacted in our history. Let them be reassured. Neither civil war nor war abroad shall rend the entrails of our beautiful France. Let them be reassured on our National Assembly, for there will be neither Montagnards nor Girondists. Yes, let them be reassured, and let them help to give to Europe a magic sight. Let them show the universe that in France there has been no violence in the Revolution, that there has only been a change of system, that honor has succeeded to corruption, the sovereignty of the people and of equity to odious despotism, force and order to weakness, union to castes, to tyranny this sublime device: liberty, equality, fraternity, progress, civilization, happiness for all, and all for happiness. But the government began to push utopian reforms, and people in Paris and provinces began to fear the workers as revolutionaries. Louis Blanc proclaimed the goal of absolute domination of the proletariat. Then a demonstration in favor of Poland led to scene. Webster 150 through 152. The revolutionaries, now legally excluded from the government, were obliged to cast about for a further pretext to stir up the people. This was provided by a revolt in Poland, which the Prussian troops had ruthlessly suppressed on the 5th of May, and the working men of Paris were summoned to assemble in their thousands as a protest against this display of arbitrary authority. Accordingly, on the 13th, as procession of 5,000 to 6,000 people marched to the Place de la Concorde, shouting, "Vive la Pologne!" The working men in the crowd, who had started out in all good faith to agitate, as that had been told to do, in favor of oppressed Poland, were animated by no revolutionary intentions, and never dreamt of overthrowing the assembly elected by universal suffrage. But, as usual, agents of disorder had mingled in their ranks, strangers of sinister appearance, ready to side either with police or mob in order to provoke a riot. Well-dressed women not of the people were observed inciting the crowd to violence. At the bridge of the Concorde, the procession seemed to hesitate, but Blanqui, now placing himself at its head, cried loudly, "Forward!" And the whole mass surged towards the palace occupied by the assembly. The small number of National Guards assembled proved powerless to stem the oncoming tide of 150,000 men and women, which pressed onwards with such force that a number of people were crushed to death at the entrance of the palace. It was then that Lamartine, braver than his predecessors, the revolutionaries of 1792, came forward out of the assembly and faced the people. "Citizen Lamartine," said one of the leaders, "Laveran, we have come to read a petition to the assembly in favor of Poland." "You shall not pass," Lamartine answered imperiously. "By what right will you prevent us from passing? We are the people. Too long have you made fine phrases. The people want something besides phrases. They wish to go themselves to the assembly and signify their wishes." How true was the word uttered by a voice in the crowd at this juncture. "Unhappy ones, what are you doing? You are throwing back the cause of liberty for more than a century." In vain, the men who had raised the storm now tried to quell it. Whilst the crowd pressed onwards into the hall of the assembly, Thomas, Raspail, Barbes, Ledru-Rollin, Bouchez, Louis Blanc struggled amidst the suffocating heat of the May Day and the odor of massed humanity to make their voices heard. Louis Blanc at the table declared that the people, by their cries, had violated their own sovereignty. The crowd responded with the shouts of "Vive la Pologne! Vive la Organisation du Travail!" Louis Blanc, attacked with the weapon he himself had forged, was reduced to impotence. It was no longer the theorist who had deluded them with words that the people demanded, but Blanqui, the man of action, the instigator of violence and fury. "Blanqui! Where is Blanqui? We want Blanqui!" was the cry of the multitude. And instantly, borne on the shoulders of the crowd, the strange figure of the famous agitator appeared, a little man, prematurely bent, with wild eyes, darting flame from hollows deep sunk in the sickly pallor of his face, with black hair shaved close like a monk's, his black coat buttoned up to meet his black tie, his hands encased in black gloves. And at this sinister vision, a silence fell upon the crowd. Blanqui, suiting himself to the temper of his audience, thereupon delivered a harangue, demanding that France should immediately declare war on Europe for the deliverance of Poland. Truly a strange measure for the relief of public misery in Paris. Meanwhile, Louis Blanc, with a Polish flag thrust into his hands, was making a valiant effort to recover his popularity. An eloquent discourse on the sovereignty of the people had at last the desired effect, and amidst cries of "Long live Louis Blanc! Long live the social and democratic republic!" he too was hoisted onto the shoulders of the people and carried in triumph. But the emotion of the moment proved too great for the frail body. Louis Blanc, his face streaming with perspiration, attempted in vain to address the crowd. But no sound came from his lips, and finally, lowered to the earth, he fell, fainting on a seat. The dementia of the crowd, urged on by the clubistes, now reached its height. Whilst Barbos vainly attempted to deliver a speech, the tribune was assailed by a group of maniacs, who with clenched fists threatened each other and drowned his voice in tumultuous cries. To add to the confusion, the galleries began to break down under the weight of the increasing crowd, and a bursting water tank flooded the corridor. At this juncture, Huber, who had likewise fallen into a long swoon, suddenly recovered consciousness, and, mounting the tribune, declared in a voice of thunder that the assembly was dissolved in the name of the people. At the same moment, Buchez was flung out of his seat. Louis Blanc was driven by the crowd out onto the esplanade of the Invalides. Raspail fainted on the lawn. Sobriere was carried in triumph by the workmen, and Huber disappeared. Then followed the inevitable reaction. The troops arrived on the scene and dispersed the crowd. Barbos was arrested. Louis Blanc, with tumbled hair and torn clothes, succeeded in escaping from the National Guards and took refuge in the assembly, only to find himself assailed with cries of indignation. "You always talk of yourself. You have no heart." Whilst these extraordinary scenes had been taking place at the assembly, another crowd of 200 people had invaded the prefecture of police, where Cassadiore, following the example of Potion on the 10th of August, remained discreetly waiting to see which way the tide turned before deciding on the course he should take. Faced by an angry mob of insurgents, the wretched Cassadiore, hitherto in the vanguard of revolution, now began to talk of constitutional authority, and threatened to run a rebel through the body with his saber. With the aid of the Republican Guard, the prefecture of police was finally evacuated, and throughout Paris the troops set about restoring order. "The repression," writes the Comtesse d'Agoult, "is without pity, because the attack has been terrible." Words ever to be remembered by the makers of revolution. The fiercer the onslaught, the fiercer must be the resistance, and anarchy can only end in despotism. Even the revolutionary leaders are obliged to admit the reactionary effects of May the 15th, and the people themselves, always impressed by a display of authority, sided with the victors. When on the 16th of May the arrested conspirators left for Vincennes, they heard, on going through the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the imprecations of the crowd of men, women, and children, who, in spite of the extreme heat of the day, followed the carriages with insults in their mouths as far as the first houses of Vincennes. But this revulsion of popular feeling was only momentary. Before long, the socialists had re-established their ascendancy over the people. In the by-elections on June the 5th, Pierre Leroux, Proudhon, and Cassadiore were all successful, and the situation was further complicated by the election of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. It was now that the imperialist schemes of the Bonapartistes first became apparent, and that the cry of the Vive l'Empereur was first heard. The leaders of this faction, no less than those of the socialists, realized that the overthrow of the existing government must be brought about by a popular insurrection, and the usual weapon of class hatred was employed by both with equal unscrupulousness. When elections held, the majority in assembly was monarchist. 3 days in June, all the parties were in the streets, and National Guards mowed them all down. Then followed the 3 fearful days of June the 22nd to the 25th. Barricades were once more erected in the streets, and war to the knife was declared on the Republic. As in every outbreak of the world revolution, the insurgents were composed of warring elements, all resolved to destroy the existing order and all animated by opposing aims. Thus, the crowds that took part in the insurrection included, besides the workmen driven by hunger and despair to revolt, a number of honest and credulous people duped by the agitators, communists, dreamers of a utopia amongst which each has his system and disagreeing with each other, legitimists, demanding the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty in the person of the Duc de Chambord, Bonapartistes, partisans of a regency, and finally, the scum of all parties, convicts and wastrels, in a word, the enemies of all society, men vowed by instinct to ideas of insurrection, theft, and pillage. Against this terrible army, the troops, reinforced by National Guards from all over France, displayed the greatest vigor, and on the 26th of June, after terrible fighting which left no less than 10,000. 10,000 killed in Paris. Revolution spread to Germany, Austria, Italy, England, Spain, but repressed everywhere. Then comes Marx and organized party of revolution to make a successful revolution. Transcript of lost tape begins. Thousands killed in Paris. From there, the revolution spread to Germany, Austria, Italy, England, Spain. There were demonstrations in many places, but almost everywhere it was repressed quite quickly, and it was the fact of the failure of this revolution that inspired Marx. Marx decided now it is time to plan very carefully for a successful revolution in the future, and not just have high ideals and make demonstrations. In France itself, Napoleon quickly took power and ran an election. Everybody, all the men in France voted, and there were 7 million votes to 700,000 to make him emperor, which showed what the people believed when they got a chance to elect. And somebody asked, "Why did you elect Napoleon? What does he have?" Can I have been with Napoleon in Russia and not vote for the descendant of Napoleon? Marx and Engels. So now we come to the people, the socialists, the anarchists of the late 19th century who prepared the history of the 20th century. The first one we will describe briefly is Marx, who together with Engels are the ones who laid the foundation for Marxism in Russia. Engels himself was a factory owner and spent his time in England. He owned a factory in Manchester. Marx was a Jewish journalist who apparently didn't do a lick of work in his life, was constantly inspired by revolutionary ideas and thinking about how to make revolution come about. In 1844, the two of them met in Paris in 1847. They joined the Communist League, a small secret group of revolutionaries, something like the quintets we read about in Dostoevsky. According to Engels, this little group was actually not much more than the German branch of the French secret societies. This group tried to infiltrate other groups, produced propaganda, and worked on the question of evolving a successful system, particularly with guns. In 1848, just before the revolution broke out, Marx published his Communist Manifesto, telling all the workmen of the world to unite and throw off your chains. In the course of his life, he was never particularly concerned with the workmen. The workmen were always much more conservative. He was only interested in using this group to make them dissatisfied and then to use this dissatisfaction in order to bring about a new government, which would put into effect his principles. His principles he got from several sources. Of course, the chief one is the French Revolution and the idealistic socialists. Only later he was so much against these because they were not scientific. But his millenarian ideas come straight from them. Then the ideas of the British economists of his time, most of which the British economists later on revised because they were unrealistic. But he took the earlier ones which were later abandoned. Another was German idealistic philosophy, especially Hegel with his idea of the march of God through history. Only he took away the God. In fact, they said they found Hegel on his head, and they turned him right side up by taking away God. And they made his system of dialectics into a dialectical materialism. That is, explaining everything that happens in the world as the basis of a sort of providence, which acts throughout history only without God. Some kind of causes which cannot be reversed. That gives communists their confidence that they are on the side of history, because, simply, things must go that way. That's the way the world works. These ideas were atheistic, materialistic, extremely naive. Science is the answer to everything. The philosophy itself is extremely stupid, and there is nothing much worth believing. But his, Marx's, power comes from his passion to overthrow the existing order, and he used as his scapegoat the bourgeoisie, the middle class, whom he saw were making the workers their slaves. Now, revolution enters a new phase. Before, it was the bourgeoisie who wanted to overthrow the aristocracy and the monarchy, and now it's the lower classes, supposedly, who want to overthrow the bourgeoisie. He worked to develop the class consciousness so that the workers would hate the bourgeoisie and vice versa. And to a large extent he succeeded, because the very violent scenes of the revolution followed, because these two groups began to distrust each other. In 1864, a group of labor organizations met in London to form what was called the First International, and Marx took over the leadership and used this to publish his own ideas. Anyone who disagreed with him he fanatically opposed. And he was against everyone, including most of the workers, because they did not agree with his philosophy. He gradually managed to throw out of this international everyone who was against his ideas. He also hated the peasants. The proletariat he hated. He called them lupin proletariat, the ragged proletariat. He had not love at all for anyone. From that time on, especially in the 80s and 90s, the various socialist parties began to organize themselves and develop, and that's when the Russian Communist Party was formed. Bakunin. The second of these thinkers is Mikhail Bakunin. Marx lived in 1818 through 1883, Engels 1820 through 1885, and Engels' chief function was to support Marx and to agree with his ideas and so forth. Marx was a great intellect. Bakunin is a different sort of thinker. He lived in 1814 through 1876. He came from Russian nobility, was quite intelligent, extremely lazy, spent his days in bed, went to military school for a while but didn't succeed because he was so lazy. He dabbled in philosophy and became a professional revolutionary. He was constantly borrowing money to go from one town to the next to start a revolution. He became friends with Marx in one of his travels abroad, and Marx immediately saw that he had great revolutionary energy because he was very fired up with hatred for the old order, and therefore he tried to use him for his own purposes. He clearly recognized the value of the Russian as a huge dynamic force to be made use of, and then cast aside when it had served his purpose. The one thing to understand is that the power of Marxism lies in hatred, and when Lenin came to power, he used complete ruthlessness, no pity, absolutely kill, destroy, have no pity on anybody, no mercy. There is a description here on how Bakunin was still young, 29 years old, and met Marx in 1844 in Paris. Marx and I are old acquaintances. I met him for the first time in Paris in 1844. We were rather good friends. He was rather much more advanced than I was, as today he still is, in his revolutionary ideas. Not more advanced, but incomparably more learned than I am. Marx had studied all these philosophers and systems, but Bakunin was just spontaneous. I knew nothing then of political economy. I had not yet got rid of metaphysical abstractions, and my socialism was only that of instinct. He, though much younger than I, was already an atheist, a learned materialist, and a thoughtful socialist. It was precisely at this epoch that he elaborated his first foundations of his present system. We saw each other fairly often, for I respected him very much for his knowledge and his devotion, passionate and serious, though always mingled with personal vanity, to the cause of the proletariat, and I eagerly sought his conversation, which was always instructive and witty when it was not inspired by petty hatred, which, alas, occurred too frequently. There was never, however, any frank intimacy between us. Our temperaments did not permit it. He called me a sentimental idealist, and he was right. I called him a vain man, perfidious and crafty, and I was right also. In 1848 the revolution broke out in France, and Bakunin wanted to take part in it. One of his French fellow socialists said about him, "What a man! The first day of a revolution he is a treasure. The second, he is only good to shoot." He did not care about the ideas of the revolution. He cared only about the energy, the demonic powers which were unleashed. We have a description of how he behaved in the revolution of 1870. First, we will quote from that concerning the revolution of 1848, when he was first in Paris during the revolution of 1848. He was then sent with a mission to stir up revolution in the eastern countries. He went to part of western Russia, then was in Prague, then in Dresden, where he finally was arrested, and was sent by the German-Austrian authorities to Russia. He was placed in the fortress of Saints Peter and Paul, and Count Orloff came to visit him, and urged him to write a confession of his misdeeds for the emperor as to a father confessor. Bakunin complied, and Nicholas I read it and said, "He is a brave boy with a lively wit, but he is a dangerous man and must be kept under lock and key." This was quite realistic. However, he escaped to London, and, after the new Emperor Alexander II read his confession, and saw that he had no repentance, he was sent to Siberia and then escaped, across Asia and America to London. From then on, that was where he spent most of his time, in London, Italy, and Western Europe. He founded various secret societies and has as his disciple a certain Mikhail, a young man who was one of the most ruthless nihilists that this time knew. Bakunin had this revolutionary fever, and in these 60s he was surrounded by conspirators of all nationalities, was constantly working of fresh plots, stirring up revolutions everywhere, trying to stir up the Poles to rebel. And Herzen, the liberal, describes him this way when he saw him in London. Bakunin renewed his youth. He was in his element. It was not only the rumbling of insurrection, the noise of the clubs, the tumult of the streets and public places, nor even the barricades that made up his happiness. He loved also the movement of the day before, the work of preparation, the life of agitation, yet at the same time rendered continuous by conferences, those sleepless nights, those parleyings and negotiations, rectifications, chemical ink, ciphers, and signs agreed on beforehand, and Herzen, who took revolution more seriously, adds that Bakunin excited himself exactly as if it were a question of preparing a Christmas tree. That is, he is not terribly serious, but he has this revolutionary ardor which is very useful to people who want to overthrow governments. Nechayev, this young anarchist, was at first a disciple of Bakunin, and then Bakunin began to see that he was rather more revolutionary than he had suspected. He helped Bakunin to write what is called the Revolutionary Catechism, which says, among other things, the revolutionary must let nothing stand between him and the work of destruction. For him there exists only one single pleasure, one single consolation, one reward, one satisfaction, the success of the revolution. Night and day he must have but one thought, but one aim, implacable destruction. If he continues to live in this world, it is only in order to annihilate it all the more surely. But about 1870, Bakunin discovered that Mikheyev, while pretending to be his most devoted disciple, had all the while been a member of another society still more secret, and of which he had never divulged the inner mysteries to Bakunin. Bakunin wrote to a friend, "Nechayev is a devoted fanatic, but at the same time a very dangerous fanatic, and one with whom an alliance could only be disastrous to everyone. This is why. He was first a member of an occult committee which really had existed in Russia. This committee no longer exists. All its members have been arrested. Nechayev alone remains, and alone he constitutes what he calls the committee. The Russian organization having been destroyed, he is trying to create a new one abroad. All this would be perfectly natural, legitimate, and very useful, but the way he goes to work is detestable. Keenly impressed by the catastrophe which has just destroyed the secret organization in Russia, he has gradually arrived at the conclusion that in order to found a serious and indestructible society, one must take as a basis the policy of Machiavelli, and adopt in full the system of the Jesuits, bloody violence and a lying soul. Truth, mutual confidence, serious and severe solidarity exist only among about 10 individuals who form the sanctum sanctorum of the society. All the rest must serve as a blind instrument and as matter to be exploited by the hands of these 10 men really solidarized. It is permitted, and even ordered, that one should deceive them, compromise them, steal from them, and if needs be, ruin them. They are conspiracy fodder. In the name of the cause he must get hold of your whole person without your knowing it. In order to do this, he will spy on you and try to get hold of your secrets. And for that purpose, in your absence, left alone in your room, he will open all your drawers, read all your correspondence, and when a letter seems interesting to him, that is to say, compromising from any point of view for you, or for one of your friends, he will seal it and keep it carefully as a document against you or against your friend. When convicted of this in a general assembly, he dared to say to us, "Well, yes, it is our system. We consider as enemies, whom it is our duty to deceive and compromise, all those who are not completely with us. If you have introduced him to a friend, his first thought will be to raise discord, gossip, and intrigue between you. In a word, to make a quarrel. If your friend has a wife, a daughter, he will try to seduce her, to give her a child, in order to drag her away from official morality and to throw her into an attitude of forced revolutionary protest against society. All personal ties, all friendship, are considered by them as an evil which it is their duty to destroy. because all this constitutes a force which, being outside the secret organization, diminishes the unique force of the latter. Do not cry out that I am exaggerating. All this has been amply developed and proved by me. Bakunin himself, however, is no one to be criticizing him, because his own philosophy is very similar. It is just that he was not quite so thorough as this Nechayev. He wrote in his Revolutionary Catechism, "Our task is terrible, total, inexorable, and universal destruction." Again, he says, "Let us put our trust in the eternal Spirit which destroys and annihilates only because it is the unsearchable and eternally creative source of all life. The passion for destruction is also a creative passion." And once he was asked what he would do if the revolution was successful and the new order of his dreams came into being, he said, "Then I should at once begin to pull down again everything I had made." In him, we see a primordial human will to destroy and to rebel. This is the passion for rebellion which we have seen in recent writers like Camus, the existentialist who says that the only thing that proves that I exist is the fact that I have a will to rebel. Bakunin, when he was praising the proletariat in 1871, afterwards named the Commune in Paris, he called it the modern Satan, the author of the sublime insurrection of the Commune. Again, discussing the loss of the revolution in 1871, he says, "The cause is lost. It seems that the French, the working class itself, are not much moved by this state of things. Yet how terrible the lesson is! But it is not enough. They must have greater calamities, ruder shocks. Everything makes one foresee that neither one nor the other will be wanting. And then perhaps the demon will awake. But as long as it slumbers, we can do nothing. It would really be a pity to have to pay for the broken glasses. Our task is to do the preparatory work, to organize and spread out, so as to hold ourselves in readiness when the demon shall have awoken." This desire for revolution, we must understand, is a very deep part of this whole revolutionary movement, not just some accidental part. The revolution is not caused by idle dreamers who just want to blunder their way into a better order of things or to revise the government. The deepest motive for revolution, as we see clearly in these radical thinkers of the last part of the 19th century, is really the idea that everything must be destroyed. And they didn't think much about what was to happen after that. They have this satanic inspiration to destroy. We see later in art, in 1914, a movement broke out called Dada, which is considered very formative for later artists. These artists would glue bits of newspaper advertisements into collages or arrange copies of old masters upside down, just to look bizarre. But there is a meaning behind all this. The philosophy of the art of Dada is summed up in one of their manifestos. Let everything be swept away. No more of anything. Nothing. 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 This is what is called nihilism, the desire to sweep away God, government, morality, art, culture, civilization, everything, which is what is set forth in the philosophy set forth by Weishaupt and the Illuminati, the complete overthrowing of civilization. What comes after that, as we shall see, is something else. But all this is still philosophy. We must look at how this was put into effect. In fact, if we could not see in the last 100 years how this was put into effect, we would not understand what their philosophy is. We would still think that it was an isolated incident of some crazy people. But beginning especially in 1871, this philosophy began to be put into practice. When the Napoleonic Empire, the Third Empire, was overthrown after the disastrous loss to the Prussians in 1870, the revolution again broke out in France. It broke out first in the provinces, and Bakunin, who was in Italy, ran as fast as he could to Lyons in the south in order to take part. He and his disciples were the chief ones who were doing this. He borrowed some money, of course, to get there and put himself in the civic center where the new revolutionary government was entrenched, and nobody had any clear idea of what they wanted to do. There were public meetings of extraordinary violence taking place, in which the most bloody motions were put forward and received with enthusiasm. And this, of course, was what Bakunin loved. On the 28th of September, the day of his arrival, the people had seized the Hôtel de Ville, the civic center. Bakunin installed himself there. Then the critical moment arrived, the moment awaited for so many years, when Bakunin was able to accomplish the most revolutionary act the world has ever seen. He decreed the abolition of the state, but the state, in the shape and kind of 2 companies of bourgeois National Guards, entered by a rear door and chased him away. Nevertheless, the idea is there to abolish the state. Then the revolution broke out in Paris, and the First International under Marx tried to dictate the progress of the revolution from London. But they were not able to do this very well, and so the revolution in Paris took its own course, which became more and more violent. The churches were closed and turned into clubs. Priests were arrested and killed with great bloodiness, and the institutions of the first revolution of 1793 were resurrected. The revolutionary calendar was restored. It was proclaimed that this was the year 79 of the new order. The Committee of Public Safety of the Terror was restored. The cross on top of the church of the Pantheon was broken, and in its place was put the red flag, and the temple was dedicated to the great men of all ages. Then there was an obelisk, a great pillar 150 feet high, comparable in size to the Washington Monument. Then there was an obelisk, a great pillar 150 feet high, comparable in size to the Washington Monument, and the Place Vendôme, which was originally erected to the memory of Napoleon, which had scenes from his great triumphs around it, and on top a great statue of Napoleon in a toga. They decided that this was a symbol of the past order, and they were going to tear it down. They thought for a long time how they were going to do it. Finally, they decided they would simply saw it off at the bottom and pull it over like a tree. It was made of cement or bronze or something, and they chipped away on one side, sawed on the other side, and prepared the great day when they would bring it down and end the old order. They really had no idea of what would happen. Some thought it would cause an earthquake. It weighed thousands of tons. Others said it might break through the ground all the way into the sewers and completely ruin the sewers of Paris. But they decided the idea was worth it anyway. So they put tons and tons of straw to make a soft bed for it, and at 3 p.m. they all came together, stood on the reviewing stand, and ordered the ropes to be pulled. They pulled them, and at first it didn't work. Several people were killed in the process, and somebody cried, "Treason! Treason!" They tried again, and finally the whole thing came down and broke into pieces, and the statue of Napoleon was broken. And this was a symbol of their triumph over the old order. A completely senseless kind of thing to do, but, from their point of view, it was a symbolical act which shows that they are going to be removed from all influences of the past. They arrested the Archbishop of Paris. Later on, he was murdered. As the revolution went on, it became more and more violent. They even tried to arrest the painter Renoir, who was busy sketching some boats on the Seine, and they said, "Aha, spy!" and they immediately arrested him, and he was going to be executed immediately, because that was the principle. You arrest a spy and immediately execute him. It so happened that the head of the secret police was an old friend of his, and he saw he was being arrested, and he embraced him and let him go. Otherwise, Renoir would never have painted all those paintings so familiar to us. There were many radical painters, as for example, Gustave Courbet, who was one of the leaders of the Commune, and it was one of his own ideas to take down this tower because he called it an insult to artistic sense. When the Republican army invaded Paris, because at this time there were no more monarchy and no more Napoleon, it was a matter of the Republicans versus the Communards, and there was now terrible violence on both sides. Both were butchering each other with great glee. When the Communards saw that the revolution was being lost, they were losing street by street in Paris, they decided that they were going to destroy Paris. So they placed, first of all, an immense amount of dynamite and gunpowder in the Tuileries, the palace of the kings where Napoleon III was, and blew it up, whereupon they claimed, "The last relics of royalty have been vanished." And then they proceeded to go to the next one. They blew up the Hôtel de Ville, a 13th century building where the civic center was, and they went to blow up Notre Dame Cathedral, but discovered that next door was a hospital for their own people, and they decided to spare it. And then some wild women, such as were taking part in the First Revolution of 1793, began going through the streets with some kind of flammable material and causing fires. Whole avenues in Paris were burning. At night it looked as though the whole of Paris was in flames. There is, in fact, a book called Paris Burning. One must understand that this is not something exceptional, but only a part of that same spirit that Bakunin had. Let us destroy the old order, even if they don't know what is going to replace it. Later on, we will see that this spirit did not come to an end in 1871. The inspiration of the Commune, which Marx said was a great deed in the Red Revolution, in fact, he was the chief apologist for the Commune and said, "This is the standard of what we will have to do in the future. People are now being aroused, and this is what we need to cause the revolution." From that time on until 1917, the revolution began to take very violent forms, although it was still a matter more or less of hit and miss. The Tsar was assassinated in Russia in 1881. In America, President Garfield was assassinated by a Red Revolutionary. In 1901, McKinley was assassinated again by some kind of anarchist. In fact, all the assassinations of American presidents were done either by anarchists or communists. The President of France was assassinated in 1870. And there were many attempts on princes in Russia and kings and presidents in the West, all with no seeming purpose in mind, just the idea of getting rid of the old order. This is the spirit of which Bakunin was a very strong representative, but which now becomes the inheritance of the whole revolutionary movement: destroy the old order. Proudhon. There is one more writer, philosopher, anarchist, at this time, whom we should study briefly, because he introduces a few ideas which make this philosophy more comprehensible. This man is P.J. Proudhon. He was active in the middle of the century. He took part in the Revolution of 1848. To him belongs the famous phrase, "Property is theft," which he thought was his chief contribution to the revolutionary movement, although actually a very similar thing had been said by Rousseau and by 18th century thinkers. He is remarkable for at least three things. First, he proclaimed that the revolution is not atheistical, but rather anti-theistical. He said, "The revolution is not atheistic in the strict sense of the word. It does not deny the absolute. it eliminates it. The first duty of man, he says, on becoming intelligent and free, is to continually hunt the idea of God out of his mind. For God, if he exists, is essentially hostile to our nature. Every step which we take in advance is a victory in which we crush the divinity. God, if there is a God, is the enemy of humanity. Bakunin also said something similar. If God really existed, it would be necessary to abolish him. And we see now in Russia, after 60 years, the government is not really atheistic, it is anti-theistic. It fights against God. 2. Invoked Satan. Bakunin said he was on the side of Satan, the eternal rebel, the first freethinker and emancipator of worlds. Nietzsche proclaimed himself Antichrist, and Proudhon, "Come to me, Lucifer, Satan, whoever you may be, devil whom the faith of my fathers contrasted with God and the Church. I will act as spokesman for you, and will demand nothing of you." Poets, decadents, and the avant-garde in general since the Romantic era have been greatly fascinated by Satanism, and some have tried to make it into a religion. Proudhon, in so many words, actually invoked Satan, like mentioned. We see here that the revolutionary movement becomes consciously Satanistic. The third idea of Proudhon, which is very remarkable, is that in the end, he decided that we should keep Catholicism the way it is, that is, the rites of Catholicism, only we will give them a new meaning. Under the outward guide of Catholicism, we will have the revolutionary message of equality, of Satanism, etc. In that he is, of course, only carrying on the idea of Saint Simon, who called for a new Christianity, that is, keeping the form of the old Christianity, but making it something new. And today we see very clearly how socialism and Catholicism are in fact getting closer and closer together. And this profound revolutionary sees that the idea of communism, of socialism, of anarchism is in some way a religious idea which takes the place of religion. By the end of the 19th century, we see that the revolutionary movement has become quite explicitly and openly ruthless and bloody. Already there have been several examples, especially the Commune of 1871, where the idea of universal destruction and ruthless order have already begun to be put into practice. A person who is very conscious of the currents going on in the world could already by the end of the 19th century have said that the 20th century is going to be something frightful, because these things, these ideas, are not simply the property of a few crazy people, but are getting into the very blood of the European people, and are going to produce some terrible effect when it all filters down to the lowest level, to the common people. In fact, when Nietzsche even said, "When my ideas, the ideas of nihilism, penetrate to the last brain of the last person, then there will be such a storm as the world has never seen." This concludes Part 1 of Lecture 9 of Orthodox Survival Course by Father Seraphim Rose and Father Podmashinsky. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, and comment below. And be sure to check out my social media in the description. I would like to post content more often for y'all, but I work 2 jobs, so I work on videos when I can. However, I have just made a Patreon, and if you contribute that way, you can help me to buy top-of-the-line recording equipment, ramp up the speed that I can produce videos, aka 1 or more videos a week consistently, by enabling me to reduce my hours at work to part-time or more, and lastly, by helping me reach more people from implementing both of these. Regardless, I would like to thank all of my listeners and supporters for helping to motivate me and sharing my work. I really appreciate you. That all being said, God bless.